So today we will be talking about carbon taxes and cap and trade. So this is kind of the last set of lectures this week and next week. And these are going to be looking at applications of some of the modeling techniques to real-world policy. And so today we're going to talk specifically about carbon taxes and cap and trade. We talked a lot about the social cost of carbon last week. And carbon taxes and things like cap and trade are essentially ways that you might realize something like a carbon price in our society, right? This is how you would translate that into like a market-based mechanism. Okay, so let's start off some definitions. So who knows what an externality is? Yes. Only one person in this class knows what an externality is. A couple people. Okay, tell me about an externality.
Sort of like a market transaction between a seller and buyer. An externality is a cost that is not captured in the price.
Perfect. Yes. So some side effect of an activity between someone buying and selling something, right? And that cost or benefit, you can have positive externalities, is not reflected in the transaction of that particular good or service. So what are some examples of externalities? Driving a car. Is driving a car an externality or?
Well, the CO2 emissions.
Yeah, okay. So you drive a car, you paid for the car to use it, but the emissions from the car affects other people, and those people had no bearing on your transaction for purchasing the car. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Any other examples? Congestion? Okay, so tell me about that in relation to these things that we're talking about.
So if I'm driving a car,
Yes?
I'm causing more congestion than, for example, people traveling in a bus.
Okay.
So I have more externality than
Okay. So yes, but yeah, talk about it in reference to kind of the definition of externality. So who's it affecting, and why would it be considered an externality?
It's affecting everyone else on the road.
Yeah.
Because they're spending more time traveling.
Yeah. And importantly, they had no involvement with that transaction of you driving, right? Yeah. Noise pollution. Okay.
Whenever you're transporting goods, people on like a busy freeway, aren't you aren't really incorrect.
They hear the noise.
Yeah.
They hear the noise, but they weren't compensated, right, by the person causing the noise, right? Okay. Yeah. So always think about, when you're thinking about an externality, always go back to who is being affected and their involvement with the transaction for that good or service. Okay? That'll be kind of the easiest way to keep straight in your mind like what would constitute an externality. You can always go back to this very straightforward definition. Okay, so today we're going to talk about two different mechanisms that help us turn an externality or let us reflect the costs of externality to society. So that's called internalizing an externality, right? And so those two are a carbon tax, where we directly put a price on carbon emissions, and then cap and trade. So this is like a permit system, also called allowances, and essentially, as a polluter, you have to have some number of permits to emit, well, we're talking about CO2. And then if you want to increase the amount of emissions that you have, then you have to buy permits from other people who are willing to sell or trade. So this is also known as an emissions trading scheme. So we'll look at a couple examples of that as well.
And can you give us an example of cap and trade?
Yes, like a cap and trade policy. Yeah, like California has a cap and trade policy. It's called cap and trade. But we're gonna like look in more detail. Yeah, so we'll see. Okay, so first off, carbon taxes. Here are worldwide prices for carbon. Some of these actually include like prices that come out of cap and trade. So this isn't just carbon taxes. Think about how aligned are prices of carbon worldwide. So what is the difference between some of these prices that you're seeing here, like a carbon price, versus what we talked about last week, total cost of carbon? Does the price need carbon? The price, if the carbon price is social cost of carbon,
There's external.
the damages of carbon is going to cost society X dollars, and we are willing to internalize Y dollars. And so the difference between the carbon tax and the social cost of carbon, which would be X minus Y, right? Those would be damages that have not been sort of internalized to society. Yeah, okay, that starts to get pretty tricky, right? So, but yes, that's exactly right. So, if you think about this from more of like a justice perspective or an equity perspective, right? You can have differentials between damages. And then for the carbon tax or price, or the price that's being set by of carbon, that's kind of like average across the whole globe, differentiated in prices by location, because you can have a big mismatch, right, between images are happening, right? And so what's a sort of easy example of this, right? So US, maybe one of the biggest emitters, right? Disproportionately so, right? So per capita, we emit much more than most other places. So, if the US were to have like a carbon tax, theoretically, the revenues that they're raising should get redistributed to the countries that are getting damaged, right? But good luck with that on the like political front. Even getting beyond even passing a carbon tax, right? What you spend the money on will be very, very tricky. So yeah, that is that can be very problematic. Yes.
So when you said that talking about trading, the carbon trading system, the amount of credit that the company.
No. Yeah, we're talking about what would a carbon tax be, right? Implement a carbon tax. Does anyone know? Basically, straight up tax, right? So there isn't anything like that. You just pay extra money.
So in the like in the world,
On there. Let me see. The very last slide of this. Tax. So some places, so the striped ones are either going to have a ETS or a carbon tax, and then they're thinking about the other one. So there's kind of a mix here, but you know, Argentina, South Africa, some provinces in Canada, and then some European countries have a carbon tax.
Is this tax on consumers or manufacturers?
Yeah. Okay. So if we want to get into the like nitty gritty of implementation, right? Theoretically, you would want the entity that's responsible for the emissions, and so this would mean actually that if every time you drive your car, right, you would pay a little bit of extra money. But from a practicality standpoint, they do for implementation a little bit upstream, and so it might be like an oil producer who pays the carbon tax, and then those prices are reflected as higher prices downstream. Yeah.
For different countries, the scale of carbon tax be the same?
No. In fact, right, even in the plot that we were showing, right, you can see you go anywhere from, you know, a couple dollars up to, you know, two. But they can be all over the place. And think about what that means. So, you know, if we go by the old social cost of carbon numbers, we had that $51 per ton. So, you know, everyone down here, basically everyone except for the EU emissions trading scheme would be lower than the social cost of carbon. And in fact, if we go by, you know, some of the new studies that are saying the social cost of carbon is $190 a ton, then no one even really comes close to offsetting the damages, right, to climate change with these prices.
I just wanted to confirm, right, ETS is equivalent to cap and trade, but it's not equivalent to a carbon tax?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So ETS is just a different different way of talking about a cap and trade. But this is more just to give some perspective on the like range of prices that we tend to see reflected in carbon markets across the globe. Okay. So how would you model the impacts of a CO2 tax? So if we think about a lot of the models and approaches that we've covered thus far in class, how would you add in something like a CO2 tax? What do you guys think? So if we were talking about our optimization-based approach, right? So something like a minimize the cost of producing energy, right? So you might have something like X generation times the cost of generation. If we sum all this up for all the different technologies, where you have to do, where subject to something like sum of xi gen has to be greater than equal to our energy demand. Okay? So this would say we have a bunch of different ways of generating energy, right, for all of the end uses of energy in our system, and it costs some amount of money, and we want to minimize the cost of doing this, but we want to produce enough energy to meet all of our demands, right? So in a system like this, where would the carbon tax kind of show up? Or where is carbon being emitted? Yeah, in generation, right? So when we create energy in the forms that we need, right, you often have some affiliation with XGen has some kind of emissions associated with it. Let's say emissions rate. So that might be your carbon intensity number for a particular type of generation. I'm guessing this is not going to be, oh, this is even better. Okay, so let me just write that again. Okay, so you'll have something like xi gen, right, which has some emissions rate associated with it. Okay. So plus xi gen times the emissions rate associated with it. Except that this is in units of dollars. This is in units of like tons or some quantity of emissions, right? So we translate to dollars via a carbon price. Okay? Okay, and so you're adding an extra sort of cost to society, essentially for generating energy for our end uses. So how does that actually reduce carbon? What do you guys think? There's a couple ways, yeah?
If you're trying to minimize generation, or if you're trying to minimize costs, then you might settle on a lower level of generation in order to do that.
Yeah, great. Okay. And so maybe, so I know it's kind of not quite reflected here, but the idea is maybe there is some elasticity related to our energy demand, right? And so maybe total energy demand is some function of the cost of generation, right? And so if you had some kind of elasticity for this, right, then as the total cost increases, then our energy demand goes down. Okay, and so this may actually be more of like an X than a C. Yeah, so that's one area where you could actually affect, you could affect your carbon emissions by just decreasing the energy demand that people have, right? And so this might be something like, so who drives a car? Yeah, so like a couple years ago, we were at, $3 a gallon, and at some point we got as high as like $6 a gallon, right? Did any of you guys who were driving a car, you were like, maybe I'll drive a little bit less because the prices are high, right? And so if you enforce the carbon tax, maybe it would change our gas price from like $4.50 today up to like $5, $6, whatever, depending on how high that your carbon tax is, right? That might make people think twice about driving, and you might drive a little bit less. Maybe that one extra trip that I would have taken, I'm like, I can get by without that, right? So that's what we're talking about here. Okay, how else might this affect carbon, your carbon price?
The CI emissions rate could go down.
How would that happen?
Like cleaner technologies.
Yeah, okay, so basically the idea is this isn't going to go away to zero, right? Like people still need energy, so, but now every time you are using energy, you're accumulating revenues from the carbon taxes, right? And so I can take that revenue and I can put it back into the system and invest in like a solar plant, wind farm, whatever, something where eventually your emissions rate will go down, thus lowering costs of everything for everyone. Okay? So yeah, what you spend on the carbon tax is a good example of doing this. Okay, so let me write these down. So we had 1, reducing overall demand. We have 2, reinvesting CO2 tax revenues into clean energy. There's one other really big one that is maybe a little bit less obvious. Did you?
Well, I'm thinking the advantage to this system over, the advantage to this is that it's independent of any market mechanisms, in the sense that, say when gas goes up, that will influence my decision to drive less, so there's less demand, and eventually the price of gas goes down again, or charging during peak times. I'll shift my charging times, so that means then the price will go down, it'll induce me to drive more again. This is going to affect everyone just every time they drive a vehicle or any carbon they produce.
Yeah, that is one of the strengths of the carbon tax, right? It's like it cares just primarily on how much is getting emitted.
Maybe it's improving the efficiency of the equipment, but it's just like the put the money into clean technology. But
Yeah,
another
you're like it is this, but I feel like you're on the right track. You're getting closer.
improve the efficiency and reduce.
So the reason why I say improving efficiency, well, okay, hold on to that thought. Yeah.
You want to spur innovation in clean energy?
That's still this, right? That's still putting money back into it. The last big one is something like this. Let's say C solar for gen cost, and C coal for gen cost. So let's say, this might be like the LCOE, right? And I'm just going to make up numbers, right? This isn't actually what it is now. But let's say solar is at $50 and then coal is at $25. So when we do this, this thing, in a cost minimization, it's just going to say, let's do coal because it's cheaper than solar. Okay, but what if with carbon price, so if you actually sum all this up, right, maybe C solar stays at 50, but then coal goes up to, let's say, 70. So in fact, irrespective of reducing overall demand, irrespective of like where that money goes, introducing this may cause your XI gen to actually change, right? You may choose to, let's say, in the grid, you may choose to now dispatch things that cost more money, but emit less carbon, right? And that would actually be cheaper in your sort of optimization. And this is actually one of the big ones, right? Just changing the kind of order of which electricity that you kind of prefer to generate from. This would be kind of analogous on a consumer level. Let's say I am a consumer that owns both a gas car and an electric car. And I am a totally 100% economically rational actor, right? And so it's just the cost of driving the gas car and the cost of the electric car. So if gas is cheaper, I'm just going to drive the gas car. And if electricity is cheaper, I'm going to drive the electric car. And so if you started out with the gas being cheaper, but with the carbon tax, it ends up making that more expensive, then you always choose the electric car first. That's kind of like the consumer version of what would be happening here, right? And so the last one is this actually changes what technologies are used to serve and demand for energy. Okay? Yeah, so these are your three main kind of effects. And actually, in terms of ranking, So I'm not an expert in this, but I believe kind of the biggest effect of the carbon tax is kind of in reverse order. So this is the biggest one, then this one, then this one. And it does depend on the like price as well, right? Because our sensitivities for like number one may vary in a nonlinear way and so on and so forth. But generally, this is the biggest impact, then this one, then this one. Okay, any questions about this? Yes?
When you talk about the third one, like I'm wondering like all those generation capacity that participate in as an ancillary services, let's suppose in the peak hours.
Okay.
And how you would do this, like, so you only have now maybe only fossil fuel options, right? Maybe you have gas plants and
Mm-hmm.
price something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So how you don't have then this third option, right? Like you can have to choose to optimize between generation and reducing the
Yeah.
emissions. So how did
They just pay more money, but you know, in any cases, right, where so short term, right, in any cases where you have options, essentially all it does is it means you may reconsider the order of your options depending on the new prices when you are influenced by carbon tax. If you only have one thing that you can do, then that's it. But you'll still be paying more money. And then long term, maybe you might consider options for if the carbon price is high enough or the carbon tax is high enough, you may consider options for building a different option, right, that would end up being cheaper in the long run, right?
like when, let's suppose when Kaiser run this dispatch, right?
Yeah.
When they have this, so they do they need to consider to minimize the, or do
Oh,
they
yeah.
just have this specific ratio and we can just go to dispatch?
Yeah, so in California, we don't have a carbon tax per se, but we do have carbon prices that are effectively a similar type of thing with cap and trade. And so absolutely, they will consider those prices. Yeah, they minimize this whole thing. Yep. That would, you know, if we had any coal plants in California, you know, kind of, let's say, even if we didn't have rules about coal specifically being banned, the market forces, especially with carbon prices, would make it so that they would never turn on, right?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like,
Yeah.
what if they have this, like, someone has this generation capacity then?
Yeah, and yeah, so that is one of the biggest influences in this part is in electricity dispatch. You may change, carbon prices are often enough to change your decision to dispatch certain types of power plants, and so I may choose to do like natural gas instead of coal, for example, and that's actually quite a large emission savings, right? So coal emits about twice as much per unit of energy as natural gas.
And even maybe some of the natural gas plants are too. Like they just wait for the very peak hours.
Yes.
What time they
Yeah. So it will affect operations for sure, and that's our biggest one here, number 3. Okay. Any other questions or comments about this? So we can. So this is kind of one example framework, right? But as you can imagine, you know, in academia, plenty of people have kind of looked at this, have generated different types of scenarios for looking at outcomes of different levels of CO2 tax. And yeah, we can kind of look at that. So EMF, the Energy Modeling Forum out of Stanford, just reminder from, I think we talked about this last time, there's a bunch of large-scale energy systems models and integrated assessment models that participate in the EMF. And we can actually look at some scenarios that essentially EMF asked these systems models to specifically look at what outcomes were. And you can see here at a really high level. So if I were to put in, a carbon price or carbon tax into the energy modeling system, what would actually happen? So these are across, so each column is a different model. And you can see if we had a $25 carbon tax at a 1% discount rate, a $25 carbon tax at a 5% discount rate, $50 1%, $50 5%. And you can see how the emissions by sector are going to be affected. So green is if it's just they didn't break it out by sectors. And then they have some of the models break it out by electricity, transportation, household and industry, and then some just have electricity and non-electric. But generally, you can see kind of over time from 2015 to 2040, how many million metric tons of CO2 you can sort of decrease as you go out sort of into the future. And you can kind of see how they compare against the sort of reference case up at the top. Okay? So as you can see, essentially the higher, right, the higher your, the higher your carbon tax value, the sort of larger your overall decrease will be over time. And we can see that kind of happening. One kind of interesting thing that you see happening in a couple of these cases is it goes down and then it kind of flattens out a little bit. So why do you guys think that might happen? Mm-hmm.
So it makes sense to do that instead of paying the tax.
Mm-hmm.
As you go further and abatement gets more and more expensive, it's no longer cost effective.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yep. And so, so if you take a particular option, right, that costs you some money, it may be cheaper to do that, right, than to pay the tax. But once you've essentially used all the cheapest options up to things that would cost you, right, $25 a ton at a 1% discount rate, you will say, okay, instead I will just pay the tax because any future options that I may have for abatement will cost more than the tax. That's right. And so we can see how that is kind of reflected in the flattening out parts of most of these plots. At a low discount rate, or I should say at a higher sort of discount rate, you'll actually see kind of drop off a little bit later on, and that has to do with, right, again, there are time value of that tax going out into the future. Yeah, and so this is a series of comparisons across a bunch of different systems models that give us some idea of essentially what a carbon tax will do for us, right? And so from a policy perspective, this is a really useful, handy tool to get an understanding of, if we were to do something like a carbon price, like what might happen to emissions, right? You'd be interested in what the sort of outcomes are from having implemented a carbon tax. And it would look something like this. Okay. Yeah, I wanted to give a little bit more detail on that paper that I was talking about whether or not our social cost of carbon reflects the true cost to society in sort of an accurate way, right? We talked about this $51 per ton, but in reality, some more recent studies have shown that that price may not be a good representation, and that in fact it should be a lot higher. And so from that study that came out, I guess almost 2 years ago at this point, we see nearly a 3 to 4-fold increase in the size of the tax. So integrated assessment model follows a 4-step process. We think about the population per GDP for a particular CO2 pathway. You've got your climate models, and then your climate change impacts translated to economic damage, and then economic discounting. So one of the big things that was implemented here was that these impacts were updated to include sort of compounding uncertainties in one of their estimators. And so that led to much higher estimates, particularly in sort of mortality. So quick, let's do, I guess, a quick sort of aside. How do you get a number for mortality? Does anyone know? So, is your life worth $1 million? Would you pay $1 million for your own life?
I wish I had that money, but yeah, if I had.
Yeah. What about like 5 million or 10 million, right? So estimating the value of a human life, yeah, makes some people feel a little bit kind of uncomfortable, right? But in actuality, there's a sort of standard practice for this, and we actually have kind of standard ways of estimating what's known as the value of a statistical life, so VSL. And so, okay, so the example that I might give, so who would say they value their life sort of infinitely? Anyone? Right, yeah, right. Like you would pay any amount of money that you own, I guess, to like preserve your life. But that's actually not reflected in the way people behave, right? And so, okay, here's an easy one. So who biked here today? A couple people. Okay, let me see. How many people have helmets? One out of all these people who biked. Oh, yes, 2. I have a helmet too. So in fact, we can measure the way people value lives based off of the behavior that they take. And you are intrinsically kind of showing your value of your life based off of like decisions that you're making, right? And so there's some cost to putting on a helmet, right? It's like, I look ugly, I'm uncomfortable, whatever, right? And then there's some risk of not wearing a helmet, right? So you're weighing the cost of wearing a helmet versus the risks of not wearing a helmet. And I can do that. I can look at a whole bunch of different behaviors, right? And I can actually elicit some kind of value that people put on people's lives. You can also think about like, oh, how productive they're going to be for society. What's the average like income that they're going to have? And so, you know, despite maybe the discomfort that you may have in putting a dollar number on someone's life, like quantitatively, it's a measurable thing, okay? And so that is kind of the theoretical foundation for where the mortality numbers come from. It was actually, so I'm fairly familiar with VSL and that sort of thing, but actually one thing that I hadn't thought about that I heard about at a conference where one of the authors of this paper was talking about one of the more controversial pieces of this particular paper is, I guess it's not too surprising if you think about it, but like one of the big controversial pieces of VSL in the US, for example, is like, okay, is everyone's VSL the same, right? So if you're like, do we value someone who's really, so I'll give the example of where this came up, like when there was a plane that crashed, I think back in the 90s, and then when people were suing the airline company, you know, they were mad that like the payout was kind of just average, right? And so someone who had a family member with a really high income, right, compared to someone who didn't, and then versus, you know, someone like a child versus an adult, right? How do you do potentials and stuff like that? So that part is already really controversial. In this, one of the big pieces is the VSL for individuals in different countries is treated differently, right? And so, you know, is it fair to say that, you know, someone in Bangladesh is different from someone in South Africa, is different from someone in France, right? And so it's a tricky question to think about in a really rigorous way. But at the end of the day, right, that leads to some of that uncertainty bar there, and yeah, hence ends up leading to these much higher values when we start including things like that in our evaluation process. Yes?
Plane crash in the 90s, is that what set the legal precedent for value of statistical life?
No, VSL has been around since well before that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I remember in September 11th payouts.
Yeah, I'm sure that it comes up every time. It for sure comes up every time. And it's like, oh, how dare you value, you know, this person's life at, I think these days, like if you, I think the value was like $2 to $3 million if you're like a middle-aged adult or something. You know, it is what it is.
They base it also on like job offers. Remember reading like if you're a coal miner, you're getting jobs more dangerous, so your pay might be a little higher. And then they factor that into.
Yeah, but except I think that for payout type things, I think the controversy is they usually use the average value. So it wouldn't, like in the calculation for the overall VSL, you would include like the number of people who were coal miners and the risk and blah, blah, blah. But then you just use an average value. Yeah.
So is VSL the same as change in life expectancy?
No. Yeah, so mortality is like is a death, like a, well, actually, no, sorry, I take that back. So I was kind of thinking in a different train of thought. So if your life expectancy changes, then yes, mortality would be included. The other one that is not included in here is morbidity, which is change in the quality of life. So if you get sick, there's different ways that we do morbidity. But generally speaking, morbidity is like way, way, way lower than mortality values. So usually it's like 1 to 2 orders of magnitude lower. So that's often not included in these systems level analyses. Yeah. So like, oftentimes for like pollution outcomes and like air quality, so nothing to do with this, but well, somewhat, but oftentimes you have like a mortality number and a morbidity number, and mortality is like much higher. Yeah. Okay, anything else about this? Yeah, okay, so yeah, carbon, so the point of this, right, is just that you know, there are a lot of people who argue, hey, you know, we should just have a carbon tax or a carbon price, and that's gonna do a lot more to solve our climate challenge than other types of policies, which will be less efficient than a carbon tax. And while I totally agree with this sort of efficiency argument, you know, one issue with a carbon price is like if I just go by, you know, my IPCC $51 a ton type thing, right? That precedes the, or not precedes, that kind of assumes the argument, right, that is the correct carbon tax or carbon price to set, where in reality it's probably a lot more uncertain than just that number. And if we were to implement a carbon tax policy and you got the number wrong, right? If we set it at $51 instead of, you know, $185, then, you know, maybe you're not quite doing enough, right? And so while I buy a lot of the efficiency arguments for carbon taxes, I would be worried that you didn't get the price right. One of my criticisms of a carbon tax. Actually, no, we talk about it in another lecture. Another big one is the regressivity, but we actually have a equity lecture in which we'll talk about some of that. Okay, so cap and trade, our other mechanism. Okay, so this one is a little bit more confusing, especially if you're hearing about this for the first time. So let's try and kind of walk through this in hopefully a kind of straightforward manner. So this is actually a description of California's cap and trade, but in principle, this is pretty much how most emission trading schemes would work. Okay. So essentially, you go around to all the producers of whatever, anyone who emits carbon, you essentially figure out how much they emit, and then when we set a cap, you give them this little ticket, and you say, all right, you can emit X tons, you can emit Y tons, and you can emit Z tons of carbon, and that's that, right? And so every year, the cap goes down, and I give another ticket to the guy, and I say, okay, last year you got X tons, but now you get like X minus 10 tons or whatever. And in that way, I am always kind of reducing the amount of carbon that's being emitted, right? Because you literally just can't emit more. You can't emit more carbon than the ticket that you got. Okay, so that's kind of the cap part of it. So you're a company, and you're like, okay, well, I can see where the cap is going every year, and I can invest in technologies to reduce my carbon so that I can keep under the allowed amount that I've been provided, right? But what if you can't do that, right? So what do? So you can say, well, this ticket only gives me X tons of carbon to emit, and so maybe someone else has a little slack in their system, so let me buy some more from this other guy who has some slack in the system, and that's going to let me emit more than my initial allowances because I can purchase more allowances from someone else, right? So what ends up happening here, right? So let's say for one entity, it's really cheap for them to lower their carbon emissions. And so let's say they do that and then they say, okay, now I have all this extra and I'm gonna sell it to other people who need it, right? And in this way, this is very similar to a carbon tax in the sense that the guys who can reduce carbon the cheapest will do it and sell allowances to people who it's going to cost the most money to reduce carbon, right? And so overall, you're still getting your cap never, you know, the trading part of it doesn't affect the cap, so you're still reducing carbon over time. That's basically cap and trade. Questions about that or confusions? Oh, I should say the last part of this is there's essentially an auction that happens on a quarterly basis where you distribute your allowances. And so people are actually purchasing those allowances from the government, which helps kind of facilitate this kind of trading process, right? Yes.
It's easier for me to see in the like carbon price or like carbon tax like system how the consumer gets looped in.
Yeah.
Like someone that's like using like a gas lawnmower or something.
Yep. Yep.
The price is just like upstream.
Yep.
But it's harder to see like how the consumer gets looped in.
Yep.
Through these.
Okay.
Because it's just like industrial scale.
Yeah. So let's say. So let's forget the trading part of it for a second, and let's say I'm a company, and I see the cap, and I can see it decreasing, and I can keep up with the pace of the decrease, right? So in year one, so I'm a company, I make these widgets, and in year one, I'm at the cap, and then in year two, I know that the cap is lowering, so I make some investments to kind of clean up the emissions that I'm doing, and then I have to do that in year 3 and 4 and so on, right, as the cap continues to decrease. And so when I make these investments into reducing my carbon emissions, that costs money, right? And so where is that money coming from? Right, I'm going to pass the cost of that into the widgets that I'm selling. So in kind of a similar way, prices go up as a result of this cap and trade thing. Yeah, whereas it's like, it's kind of different, but it's kind of the same, right, as a carbon tax. Like in both cases, it could be something upstream that gets like passed down to the consumer. Yeah. And then, you know, with trading, it's a little bit more complicated, but like let's say in the same example, essentially with a trading scheme, it would be like, oh, I can't keep up with the cap, so I'm going to purchase an allowance. And it costs me money to purchase the allowance, and then I'm going to pass that cost down to my consumers via higher prices for the widgets that I sell.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are all industries like included, like a dairy farmer or something?
Yeah, so ostensibly anyone who's emitting anything at some point in the chain would have to be, you know, part of this program. There are, yeah, it gets a little bit complicated. We're going to talk about carbon offsets in just a second, but yeah, you can, for entities that aren't included, you might be able to claim some sorts of like credits in some ways, and we'll get to that.
Is there any specific reason like to go for cap and trade instead of carbon tax?
Yeah, so there are pros and cons of a cap and trade versus a carbon tax, but as to why a particular system is chosen, I am going to venture out and say that has less to do with the benefits and costs of this versus a carbon tax, and more to do with politics about how easy it is to get a cap and trade, because there's no tax in the word, and people don't like taxes, right? So, yes.
Is this cap limited to the emissions within California, or?
Okay, we're going to get to that too. Yeah. That is a limitation not only of cap and trade, but also of carbon taxes. Yeah.
And I'm just curious about the actual logistics behind this and the bureaucracy. How is it that one determines this specific plant here produces this much carbon? How is it that this dairy farm here, it's determined they produce this much carbon? Is it just an industry-wide blanket, or can one make the argument, no, we're using this kind of technology to reduce our carbon, et cetera, et cetera? I would think that would just be such a logistical headache.
Well, I mean, to some degrees, yeah, but that's the job of the Air Resources Board, right? Is to track emissions, and so they have a pretty decent idea of what the emissions inventory is, and there's a whole system in cap and trade to figure this out. Yeah.
I'll look into that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to add that there is a secondary market
Yes.
for the carbon price, right? So although the carbon price has set in the auction, but then what people are watching is the price in the secondary market.
So that's the prices that that are from the trading, right? Yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit about that when we get to the prices. Okay, let me talk about some historical stuff about cap and trade real quick. So this came out of AB 32. So that was a bill that passed under Governor Schwarzenegger's time in office, which is the goal to reduce 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. This program was one of the many climate pieces of legislation that kicked off kind of implementation of how we would get to AB 32, right? So importantly, so one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of times economists think about carbon taxes and cap and trade as the mechanism for reducing GHGs, right? As long as you just have a carbon tax, at the social cost of carbon, whatever that may be, then you don't need to do anything else. The market will take care of everything. But actually, the impetus behind California's cap and trade does not reflect that line of thinking. This cap and trade is only accounting for a portion of the mitigation that we need for AB 32. And California did not want to rely only on cap and trade as our mitigation mechanism. And that's why we have all these other policies like our renewable portfolio standards, our zero emissions vehicle standards, all of these other things to help reduce carbon. But cap and trade fills in a lot of holes that you might miss with targeted policy like this, like those examples that I was giving. A couple other countries have joined the cap and trade program. A couple of provinces in Canada, actually. And cap and trade was set to expire in 2020, and it was extended through 2030 in 2017 as a result of AB 398. This is the cap. So over time, we have decreases in our allowable emissions And the emissions projections in the red line has kind of decreased as much kind of in line with the decreasing cap over time. Okay, offsets, carbon offsets. So this is a credit for a verified emissions reduction from a source outside of the program. So offsets can be used by covered entities to meet their obligations instead of using allowances. And so livestock, for example, isn't included under cap and trade, but if you reduce your carbon via like a livestock program, you could count that as opposed to buying an allowance to reduce your carbon emissions. Yeah, so livestock is the one that a lot of people have talked about because livestock produce a lot of methane emissions, which is a particularly bad greenhouse gas. It's like 30 times the effect of equivalent amount of CO2. Yeah, so with that one, you guys have heard about like cow farts. Although technically they're not farting, it's actually burping. They burp out emissions. And one of the successful emissions reduction programs that has been able to claim carbon offsets is actually you just change the diet of the cows and they will burp less methane. You change from like a grain-based feedstock to like a seaweed-based feedstock. Yeah. So carbon offsets, yeah. Something like this. So even if we reduce our carbon footprint, we can't reduce it to zero. So there's other projects that you might do to negate the impact of those CO2 emissions. And then you receive a certificate acknowledging that your offsets are supporting these efforts. So a lot of companies try and take advantage of carbon offsets instead of spending money purchasing allowances. Carbon offsets are great when they work, but they can be problematic. Does anyone know? Does anyone watch Last Week Tonight by John Oliver? He does a great piece on some of the problems with carbon offsets, right? And so, like, this example that you see right here, this is like, okay, there's a company that's emitting carbon. They don't want to buy allowances. They're going to buy a carbon offset. And the carbon offset that they buy is like, oh, there's this wind farm that's getting installed here, right? And so that is going to displace some of the carbon that would be generated from the thing that the wind power is replacing. And great, we're going to claim that for allowances, and that's going to let us keep emitting carbon, right? And so that's great in principle if that was exactly what was happening, but if that wind farm was getting installed anyways, right, like then your carbon offset is bullshit, right? Like this, it shouldn't count, right? And so there's a lot of this gamification of carbon offsets. And if you wanna rage more, you watch John Oliver's segments. Maybe I'll put it in a link on Canvas.
Building carbon sequestration plant is kind of also a part of
Yeah, yeah, that is, I believe, like methane capture or carbon capture of some kind could be a carbon offset.
Here you said like when they built this renewable plant, but what if they built a renewable plant to a place where they need to, let's suppose in a country which has like really high pollution, this is like under 12 countries, can like people do this? Like, if you can
Actu-
like go beyond a limit, then you can just like.
I don't think so. I think for California, the carbon offsets have to be
In the same.
in California. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's how it works. Even though technically, like greenhouse gas is a greenhouse gas, right? That affects the whole globe. But I think for this, your offsets have to be in the state.
Like I'm just thinking like the big brands or companies, if they can build some of the renewable
Uh-huh.
to the places which needs the most, like Africa or
Yes.
all those like places. Maybe like they are like kind of, it's like kind of much better to the environment as compared to building in California.
Well, okay. So what I would say about that is, yeah. So principally speaking, right, there are a lot of side benefits that come with like carbon reduction stuff. Things like health benefits from pollution, things like access and like equity issues, right? But I think when we think about cap and trade in the context of California, like it's not really designed to address those things. So there are like other outcomes that could be more efficient where you could do things like deploy clean energy in other parts of the world. You know, cap and trade is really meant to meet California specific like carbon reduction goals. And so, you know, for what it is, you know, it is what it is, right? Like there could be a different policy that's designed to like maybe it could be some kind of offset program that would be thinking about like carbon more broadly, and it could be, you know, awarding things like environmental justice and accessibility and things like that. But that's not how this program is designed. Yeah. Okay, so this slide is a couple years old. So this is what prices kind of looked like in the start of the cap and trade in the primary market, right? And there is a price floor where prices can't fall below that, although I don't know why actually those prices are below. But updated slide of that version. These are the sort of average quarterly cap and trade auction prices. And so we went out to 2017 in the previous slide. That was around $15 or so per ton. And you can see, right, as the cap goes up, you are hitting abatement technologies that sort of cost more and more. And so your prices are kind of reflective of the cap kind of increasing. I don't know why this happened. Do you happen to know what's going on with the clearing price there? I don't know why it jumped up, but anyways. So, but you guys can think about how these prices kind of relate, right, to our social cost of carbon. It is lower, and so you're not going to hit all of those abatement technologies to get to where you want. But there are other programs, like I mentioned, in California that are trying to do that. How do these compare to the secondary prices? Do you know off the top of your head? No. Okay. Yeah.
What are the secondary?
So these are the prices that happen in that auction at the beginning where you buy the allowances, but there's a secondary market where people trade some of the allowances, and those prices may differ from these prices.
In the auction, you're buying it from like the state
From
government?
yes, that's right. Yeah.
What does the state use that money on?
Two. Yeah. Clean energy stuff and yeah, cap and trade. Yeah, there's a huge allocation of funds that go out to a bunch of different things. EV incentives, for example, is one. We get some cap and trade money to do, you know, research in climate change areas. Yeah, so reinvestment into clean energy.
So in addition to auction, the companies, like, they can do this between themselves too, right?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. And what if you don't? If you're like, screw it, I don't care about your allowances. Yeah, how do you enforce cap and trade? So this is actually California Area Resources Board. When it comes to their purview, they're actually very powerful when it comes to the ability to enforce certain things. And so actually it's a health and safety code violation. So not only is it a civil penalty, it could actually be a criminal penalty. And so you could actually get jail time if you explicitly violate cap and trade. So it does have teeth to it. Okay. So let's talk about some criticisms of cap and trade. So these are kind of unique to an emissions trading scheme program. So this is a plot of how VMT has changed sort of over time. And let's suppose that as you design your cap and trade program, you want to think about the way people are using energy and their needs for certain things. And you want to adjust your cap sort of accordingly to how people need goods and services that are associated with carbon emissions. And that means that, suppose you provide allowances to some oil companies that sell gasoline with the expectation that growth is going to happen, right? And so let's say you were setting this back in the mid 2000s, right, which is around when this thing was coming out. And so you think that VMT will continue to go up like that. And so you set your allowances to be essentially equivalent to something a little bit lower, right? And so you say, this is the trend that's going to happen, and we're setting our cap in such a way that it will accommodate that sort of growth. But then what actually happens is something like that. So what does this mean? So if your allowances are set to the dotted line, how hard is it for the oil company to comply with the dotted line if what actually happens is the blue line below it? What do you guys think? So, okay, think about it this way. If you thought the future was like, okay, you as a gasoline company, you guys are supposed to sell 1 million gallons of gasoline next year, and we're gonna make the cap like 900,000 equivalent, right? And so you got to do something to figure out how to reduce your emissions, right? But it turns out you only needed to sell 800,000. Yeah.
The cost of your allowance is going to go down, so it's going to become very cheap.
Yeah.
So you're going to get more emissions.
Yeah. Well, so suddenly I have 100,000. Instead of having to deal with reducing my supply by 100,000, I now have 100,000 gallons worth of allowances extra. So I've just provided a windfall to the oil company, right? If my projection was wrong. So that is kind of a long-term criticism of cap and trade is this idea of like being able to be accurate with your caps and kind of avoiding this type of thing from happening. Okay, I think you had a comment about whether or not it would only be within California, right? So this is a pretty well-known concept called leakage, and this kind of applies to carbon taxes as well. So this is a real example. So as a cement producer, you have to face the prospect of purchasing allowances in order to operate within California. Okay, and so instead of paying for those allowances, which is going to cost me a lot of money, I'm just going to be like, screw it, I'm going to move over to Nevada and produce my cement there. Your net emissions aren't reduced because those emissions don't get counted in California. And in fact, it could be worse, right? You could move your production to Nevada and it could be dirtier than if they were in California. And so you've actually caused emissions to increase as a result of leakage. There is a special case of this called resource reshuffling. So this was studied by, so if any of you guys have taken any econ classes with Jim Bushnell, so he's pretty well known in this area. He's done a lot of work in cap and trade. And so this resource reshuffling is actually from some work that he's done where, okay, you're a utility that imports coal from other regions. Cap and trade, so when you can have these power purchase agreements, which essentially is a contract that you're going to be like, okay, I'm going to continue to buy power from you over a longer period of time. In this case, cap and trade allows the utilities to divest from some of these agreements. And so they say, okay, I said I was going to buy coal power from you over the next 10 years, but because of cap and trade, I can't do that. So I'm going to break our agreements and so that I can meet my allowances. I'm going to shift away from purchasing coal power in this like long-term contract and instead buy power from someone else. Okay, so great. So that means that in California, the utilities providing that electricity are no longer getting electricity from the coal plant. Instead, they've decided to invest in something cleaner. So what happens to those coal plants? They don't just shut off, right? Like they will find other people, other customers to sell to. And so you are then increasing emissions outside of California. And so we can actually see this happening, right? In California, your cap will eventually sort of reduce the amount of CO2 emissions within the state, but outside of California, the coal emissions will actually increase, right? With no cap, you're down here, like at 140, and then it increases up to like 150. And similarly in WPA.
Like those plants to supply to other states?
Huh?
They are now supplying to the other states?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. A lot of those were imports anyways. So. This is so this is actually related to the previous point that I was making about this one where the expectations don't kind of align, and so what ends up happening in practice is you bank up a lot of allowances, and so it may look something like this where you've saved up a bunch of allowances earlier on, and then that lets you emit higher than our like stated goals. I guess at the end of the day, your total emissions is the same, but this makes it so that you can't really, it'd be harder to meet like California's explicit carbon goals. We can just get rid of carryover for allowances. That would be an easy way to solve this. Okay. There is actually a really big secondary benefit of cap and trade from like an equity and environmental justice perspective. So anytime that I burn carbon, right, we are introducing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but you are also having secondary pollution. And so all of this, like particulate matter, SOx, NOx, local air pollution, right, which reduces air quality and leads to negative health outcomes, right? You have increased morbidity, increased mortality in places near where carbon is being burned. One really big benefit of having cap and trade and reducing that carbon emissions is that the places where carbon is being emitted, the places where you have industrial facilities and power plants and that sort of thing, are most often located in lower income communities, disadvantaged communities, places that have less kind of political power to prevent, a power plant or industrial facility from getting installed in your neighborhood. And so the benefits of something like this are actually really quite big. So you can actually see here, by race, ethnicity, by poverty status, the number of facilities, it's like disproportionately higher for places that are below poverty level and for places that have people of color. So the like carbon benefits of cap and trade help to internalize air pollution externalities as well, even if those benefits aren't like explicitly, part of the calculus for how we're setting the cap. But when you have carbon offsets, you like even a legitimate carbon offset, right? Like if you reduce like the cow methane thing or whatever, that allows those polluters to continue sort of polluting. And so carbon offsets, another sort of downside of that particular aspect of the program is that you limit the benefits of reducing local pollution. And we actually know that even if you just hit a couple of the sort of largest polluters, the secondary benefits of the program would be huge. But unfortunately, they can take advantage of carbon offsets to keep that from happening. Okay. Questions about this? Cogeneration is where you have combined things like electricity generation and heating, right? And so if I have like a boiler that is getting heated by byproduct of producing, electricity, then you're producing both electricity and heat. That's an example of cogeneration. A lot of times this is like industrial stuff too. And so industrial processes that require lots of power, they may be generating a lot of waste heat that's cogenerated into like district heating instead. Yeah, and so this is all of these. I should just mention that all of these effects of cap and trade that I'm talking about and showing examples of are trying to highlight some of the outcomes that can be measured via the modeling tools that we have been sort of covering throughout the class. And so these are highlights and examples of employing the knowledge that we've kind of gained to, help with specific sort of policies. Yeah.
You know, I took a professionals class, and I think one of the things they brought up was that when you have, or like debate in economics, is that when you have the complementary policies like LCFS,
Yep.
that it sort of raises the cost of when it's in combination with cap and trade.
Yeah.
That it sort of defeats the whole purpose of it.
To some degree.
To some degree.
Yeah.
So,
So I'll say, so Dan Sperling, who's like the head of the Institute of Transportation Studies, is kind of like on one end of the spectrum, and Jim Bushnell is kind of on the other sort of end of the spectrum in terms of like how much you should have like market-based mechanisms versus how much you should have more regulatory sort of control of these things, right? So I think Jim is totally correct in that when you add in things like LCFS and RPS and ZEV and ACT and all these other programs that are not kind of market-based mechanisms or kind of hybrid market-based mechanisms to some degree, you reduce the efficiency of your cap and trade program. I think that's like not really contestable, right? But the sort of trade-off that you're making is there's a lot of uncertainty to the degree to which cap and trade can allow us to reach our carbon goals. I think from an econ perspective, in theory, like it should work, but there are so many implementation challenges that we've kind of realized. I think California was never fully on board with putting all of their chips on cap and trade to reach those goals. And that they are willing to swallow the inefficiencies of having a lot of these other programs to hedge against the uncertainty that the program could achieve everything that they want for their climate goals. So yeah, like I would probably lean a little bit more towards like it's okay to be a little more inefficient, or a lot more inefficient, to be honest, to get at our carbon goals. I think that even if cap and trade is getting to like your $50 carbon prices, like I don't even know if that's enough, right? In terms of like what we actually want. Like there's uncertainty in what the correct social cost is, and so yeah, I think it would be difficult to have a perfect system of these things. either way.
Have there been like models that have sort of demonstrated that, or is it mostly speculation?
Models that demonstrated.
Like cap and trade, cost efficiency under various.
Oh yeah, for sure, yeah. So, yeah, that's actually more common in the like econ literature space. There have been actually there's been a lot of comparisons of cap and trade and carbon taxes. That's probably where you're going to find the most literature. But then, yeah, how does cap and trade compare against like specific regulatory regimes? Yeah, there is a little bit of literature in that area. It's challenging though, because it's like, you know, how much does a ZEV mandate, actually cost, and like, how do you compare the like cost effectiveness of that versus cap and trade? And there's like all these like ancillary effects, right? So from like a pure carbon reduction platform, it's nothing will be obviously as good as this type of stuff, but I think it's there's a lot of other pieces to consider.
Because you made the argument, am I correct, that through the combination of two of the federal CAFE regulatory framework and the ZEV, Californian ZEV mandate, it actually increased greenhouse gas emissions, correct?
Yeah, my PhD paper.
Oh, it was
Yeah.
a PhD paper.
Yeah, we could talk about that at some point. Maybe I'll add that to one of the things. It's like, yeah, multiple policies can lead to some unintended consequences, and yeah, we'll talk about that one, sure. Okay, so I promised that I would end a little bit early. So this is it for today. I already showed this kind of slide, kind of seeing where we're at. Maybe there's an update. I know there's an update. There's some places that have implemented some new things, but gives you some rough picture. Yeah, really, you want the whole globe to be colored in to avoid things like leakage and that sort of thing. But this is where we're at today. Okay. I believe the homeworks are due at the end of the day. So I know folks who are still working away at that, make sure you get that in by tonight.